Nice. My name is Gabriel. I'm project officer. I think we're gonna get started now. And welcome everyone on this webinar. Thank you everyone for making it here. We're very excited to have everyone. And today we're going to be doing part one of our webinar series on empowering patient groups in the rare research funding landscape. Part one today will be covering navigating the funding landscape in rare disease research. And of course, we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. Obviously, we'll be using Zoom today. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it, but others might be more familiar with Microsoft Teams. So I thought I would just introduce how to use Zoom. Obviously, there's a chat box where you can write any technical difficulties you have or to communicate with the Beacon staff or any other participants that you'd like to communicate with. And then there's also the Q&A box where we really encourage you to type any questions that you'd have. But please don't worry because there's been multiple times throughout the day to ask questions throughout the session and also at the end as well. If you'd like to use subtitles, that's something that you can also do in Zoom because we have live transcript and subtitles available. So what you need to do is to go on the black bar at the bottom and click on live transcript. And you can turn them off and on as you wish. And you can also view it on the site in real time if you'd like. And just an introduction to Beacon for those of you who might not know us. I hope you appreciate the Beacon logo that we just put here. It's quite festive for the season, and we're all quite excited for Christmas, so we thought we would put it here. Hope you like it. But yeah, so who is Beacon? Who are we? So Beacon is a UK-based charity focused on rare disease, with a vision of a world in which no one faces the rare journey alone, and a mission to build a united rare disease community with patient groups at its heart. You might be wondering, how do we do this? So we try to do this through three different streams. One of them is through patient group training, which is what we're doing today through this webinar, for example, in which we support patient groups to form, to grow, and also to professionalize, to have a wider impact in their community. We also aim to empower patient groups to provide emotional and practical support to their communities. And we also aim to support rare research by helping patient groups find a place at the heart of research so that they can ensure better outcomes and improve access, especially in drug purposing. And of course, ultimately, we also want to build this rare community by facilitating connections and collaborations to help grow and strengthen the rare disease community. Today's team is Hannah Harvey, our projects manager, who's going to be here with us, and she's going to be monitoring the chat as well and ready to help you with anything you need, with any technical difficulties as well. Then obviously me, which I briefly introduced, I'm project officer at Beacon. And then we also have our lovely scientific projects manager, Eve Hewitt, who's also going to be a speaker today. So we'll have you later, Eve. Sorry. So obviously, why this webinar? So why this webinar series? One of the reasons why we decided it would be great to have this webinar is because 80% of rare conditions lack approved treatments. And that means accelerating research progress is a top priority for many patient organizations, which also means that funding is essential in order to drive these efforts. And it's also important to note that funders prioritize the use of real-world evidence in applications, which means that patient groups are absolutely essential in applications for research, but navigating research funding can be really challenging. So we decided having this webinar will be really helpful to try and tackle this need. It's important to note that in today's webinar, we're going to have an angle to provide an overview of the existing funding landscape rather than to teach you how to apply for funding directly. However, our second webinar is going to be a bit more practical. It's going to happen in January, and we'll provide more information on that at the end of our presentation. And in that one, we'll be offering more guidance on how to get actively involved in supporting funding applications, but also helping you set research priorities. But however, if you wish to act as a funder or this is something that you'd be interested in, please let us know in our feedback survey that you'll see at the end of today's webinar so that we can tailor future training towards this interest. And lastly, we will discuss today the types of research that you can support beyond just clinical trials. We'll also cover different funding streams that are available from government bodies to commercial funding from industry as well. And lastly, the opportunities and limitations that are associated with each funding stream. And that will be covered by two speakers. The first one is Eve Hewitt, our scientific projects manager, which I just introduced. And then we also have the pleasure to have Toni Mathieson with us today, who is the CEO of Niemann-Pick UK. So thank you both for being here, because it wouldn't be possible without you guys. And I'm just gonna hand it over to Eve so that she can start her presentation.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for being here today. Like Gabrielle said, I think it's really important for us to explore the research landscape in general and then understand the specific nuances that are associated with rare diseases, of which there are many. I'm sure everyone is aware. Yeah, so really, I think before we think about how we fund research, what we need to do is have a bit of a refresher on what we actually mean by research. And I can't ask you directly, but I think if I said to you, what do you think research means? This is going to be what pops up in your head. So it's going to be someone in a lab, lots of fancy glassware, lots of pipettes going on, and latex gloves. That's not always the case, actually. And I think as long as you are asking a question and then you're gathering information to answer that question, if you're thinking about what that answer means and how you can use that answer to create change or improve knowledge in a certain area, that's actually research. So as long as you're asking a good question and then following this process, which is actually formally called the scientific method, what you're doing is research. So conversations are research. Doing things in the lab, that's research. All of these things, as long as you're asking someone a question, you're doing research. So yeah, so it can be many, many things, some of which I'll talk you through today. So some of the types of research that I'll talk to you today are preclinical, clinical trials, observational research, evaluative research, and qualitative research. Actually, these are all types of research that are currently ongoing, they currently happen, and they're currently funded. Like we know all of these types of research exist in the landscape as it stands now. But as technology is improving and access to technology is increasing, and we're understanding more about human biology and we're understanding more about science and where those two intersect, I think what we're going to see is new types of research up and coming. So many more yet unexplored areas of research to look forward to in the future, I think. However, I don't have a crystal ball and I can only tell you about the ones we know about right now. So the first type of research I'll talk to you about a little bit is preclinical research. And I think that's the type of research that looks most like what I showed you in that first slide. That looks like someone sitting in a lab or at a computer, very focused, very sciencey, doing research very traditionally. It really lets you explore disease and treatments in a way that doesn't involve humans initially. And there's different ways of doing this. So, for example, for drug discovery, we can use AI or we can use computer models to see how drugs stick to proteins and what that might mean for how that drug works for a particular person or a particular group of people. We also have in vitro research, which basically means looking at cells outside of an actual living organism. So we could be growing cells on a little plate in the lab and seeing if we add certain things or take certain things away, if that causes disease or prevents disease and just changes how those cells work in that plate. From there, you'll move up to in vivo research, which is kind of taking all of those previous concepts and applying them in a living organism. That living organism at this stage is not human, so it might be a mouse. There's a big movement and a lot of funding into work in smaller animal models like zebrafish or fruit flies too, which it sounds a million miles away from humans, but the research is great and I would recommend having a look. So yeah, so it's just applying everything you've got already from those other two types of research into a living organism, giving you a better idea of what this disease or treatment looks like in something that's actually, eating, drinking, living. So once you've got your foundation and you understand a bit more about the disease or a bit more about the treatment from your preclinical research, you might then want to move into the big, bold, and the expensive clinical trial. All drugs must go through clinical trial before they get to patients in clinic. And really, the The idea of a clinical trial is to make sure that a drug is safe and actually works in the way we expect it to. And this is always in humans. So what we're looking at, as I say, it's to make sure the drug is safe. And what we say when we mean safe is that side effects are either manageable or tolerable. Sometimes they're not manageable, but they will exist, and patients can say, I can cope with this. And that there's no unexpected nasty things happening as a result of this treatment. And also we start to explore how the trial drug interacts with other drugs that a patient might be taking too. So you can see here a really nice diagram of the different phases of a clinical trial. Each drug needs to go through all of these phases. So we start with smaller numbers and the numbers scale up throughout the phases, with all of them really focusing throughout on safety. Is this drug safe? So clinical trials are really all about safety of patients. So we know that for rare diseases, clinical trials can be quite tricky. If you're looking at these numbers in phase 3, that's a big number. And some rare diseases and ultra rare, there are not this many people in the world that have a particular disease. But encouragingly, there is a lot of work into new trial designs that account for these smaller populations. So that's work that is ongoing. And now I think we get into what I would think is the areas where you might not think these things that you're doing are research. And they're actually probably part of what you're doing every day. So qualitative research is really just thinking about opinions and the patient voice of a specific population. So that would be your community, your beneficiaries, and who you're talking to every day, and just how they feel and how they think about certain things. Again, the hook of all research is a research question. And the sort of things you might be asking in qualitative research might be something like, what side effect of this drug is most disruptive to the way you interact with your child on a day-to-day basis? So, really exploring those conversations that you probably are already having with the community, but trying to almost formalize them. And this can be done in a lot of different ways. It can be done in interviews, which can be quite intense, but if you just imagine yourself having a coffee and a chat, it's a lot less intense. Focus groups, again, I think focus groups are a nice way to bounce ideas off of each other, and it really draws out different ideas and themes from different people. We can have case studies, and I think you can have case studies, if we could think back to that question about what side effect disrupts your day the most, case studies of just what a day looks like and how those side effects can skew it can be actually quite powerful in thinking about how you manage those side effects, or how treatment can be tailored in the future to limit these side effects. There's also this is ethnography, which is a kind of social and behavioral science aspect of qualitative research, which really is just a fancy way for saying we're looking at how society interacts and functions. So questions here might be how carers of people with rare diseases interact with their education and work lives, and how that works in a real world situation. I think personally with quantitative research, the free-form structure of it is really beneficial, and you can get some really raw and really rich data. But it is also worth thinking about having a structured set of questions as well, just to make sure that if you want to take this piece of research to the next level, you can almost refer back and say, well, we had a standard set of questions. We've almost got a protocol here. So what we can say is we were rigorous and we actually followed a scientific method, rather than just having a chat over coffee. Whereas in truth, it is more of that chat, just with the backup of a good list of questions written down. The next type of research is evaluative research, and that looks at something that already exists in terms of systems or services. So particularly, just to say, we're focusing on the UK today, so this is quite UK tailored. So a system or a service within the NHS, and it explores if it's meeting the expectations and the standards that were set when the service was set up. This type of research can then produce a set of recommendations or a set of ways to build on this service and improve it further as a result of this piece of research. This study here, a lot of our friends at Beacon were involved with this study, which is actually, as it says here, mixed methods. So there are some database methods, there's some qualitative research methods in here, so some questionnaires, some interviews, exploring what matters to rare disease patients when looking at their care, and are they satisfied with the care they receive? So this is a really lovely example of all of the kind of out of the box methods of research I've been talking about so far. A spoiler alert, there is a specific pot of funding that the NIHR have for service evaluation and health and social care delivery. So if this is something you're thinking about doing, there is a specific set of funding dedicated to this type of research. Observational research, I think, is something that you may not be familiar with the title and the name of it, but actually it's probably something that you all engage with in some way or the other, because registries are observational research. Registries themselves are a really powerful tool for just creating that connection and creating understanding of who's out there, what their disease looks like, what their symptoms look like, and how they manage that disease. But registries can actually be a foundation for more and more research. So, for example, if you've got a registry that's saying, we see this symptom in 77% of patients, but at the moment we're not targeting this with a treatment, that can sort of spur into new pieces of research into new drugs that focus on that particular side effect or that particular symptom. Or it can change the standard of care just by saying, look, we need to think of something a little bit different because we're seeing this and we're not dealing with it. So they're a really powerful tool. And I think registries and observational studies are quite a nice method of research because they can be relatively low burden to participants. They're normally questionnaire based, or data can be gathered from electronic medical records as part of normal standard of care and normal routine medical practice, which means that after consent is signed by someone who wants to participate in this research, they don't have to do much. And I think that's quite nice. It's building up a big picture of knowledge without asking too much of the people you're gathering that knowledge from. I would say once you've got that big package of data, you might want to explore working with researchers or statisticians to kind of have a look at all the data you've got and think about what's next. Where are the themes? Where are that 77% of patients and where should we go next? This is just to show you how many registries exist. This is how much data exists. And just to say that these are the registries that exist for the letter A. So there are many, many more. And you know, this is very rich data. And if we're thinking about groups of diseases, we can lean on the data in these registries too. So it's a really, really rich source of information and a really important type of research. Yeah, so in summary, I hope that you now agree that research is a lot more than just sitting in a lab with test tubes. All research, really, the fundamental of research is asking a good question and finding an answer to that in some way or the other. I think once you've got that question in your head, you can think about what type of research you're going to do to answer that question. So it might be that qualitative design. You might want something a lot more data heavy, or you might need to go straight to the lab. And then you can think about what funding you need based on that and kind of work backwards. And again, like I say, if you're in that coffee shop having those discussions, you're probably already doing research in some form, even if it's just for your own personal interest. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions before I carry on for another half hour. Thanks, Gabrielle.
Hi, thank you, Eve. That was great. It was really good to learn more about all the different types of research that exist because most people would only think there's one or two, but there's so many. So yeah, thank you. That was super clear. And yeah, we actually have a few questions. So
Amazing.
some people are asking, what was the source of the list of registries? And yeah, what was the source of the list of registries? And if that's a worldwide list or just UK?
That's a good question. That is a worldwide list that I can share. We will share in the follow-up materials. Because frustratingly, I can't remember exactly what the source is, but yes, I have got that saved. And we will share that with our post-webinar materials.
Perfect, thank you. And then we also have someone asking, how do you do original research?
Original research.
Yeah.
That was a good question. It's a good question. I think for me, so the first thing to do is that there's been a big movement to research transparency now, which means that all research being conducted should be published somewhere. So that might be on clinicaltrials.gov if it is a clinical trial. It's a little bit harder to find if it's just qualitative research. And that, you know, that might be quite tricky to locate an actual report from. So see what's out there, first of all. And I actually think sometimes duplicating research is not always a bad thing if you're doing it slightly differently and if you're applying slightly different methods. I don't think that's a bad thing because you're kind of adding more evidence to the pool that already exists. I think if you really want to do something original, then what to me would make sense is looking at a specific question you have from the people you're interacting with. So what matters to your patient population? And I think a lot of the time, the research that is being done is kind of answering higher level scientific questions. But if you strip it back and think about questions that more relate to, like what I was saying, how side effects interact with daily life and how clinical trials can be quite complex to engage with. And just really stripping back to, let's not think about science all the time. Let's think about doing research that focuses on being a human being with a rare disease. I think there's a lot of room for originality there, particularly with the different ways rare disease interact. I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Eve. Yeah, if you have any more questions, please put them all in the Q&A box. And we also have another question here in the chat. So they're asking, are all the patient registries which are available listed in one place, or are they scattered in different places? And how accessible are they?
That's a good question. That list is very extensive, and again, we will share that. And I couldn't attest to whether that is the whole list of all the registries that exist, but it certainly is a very long list. Accessibility is a tricky one, and I think it really depends on who is holding the data of that registry. I think you're going to see more barriers if the registry is held within like a academic organisation, perhaps. And what we'll talk about next is actually how important collaboration is for research. So accessibility can be a tricky one, and I think you're a lot more likely to see engagement with a registry that was built by a patient group or a charity than perhaps from other sources. But thankfully, the majority of them are that. Personally, I don't have experience of trying to engage with these registries, so I'd actually love to hear from you guys where it has worked and where it hasn't worked. That'd be really interesting for us.
For sure. Thank you, Eve. I think the remaining questions we can maybe ask at the end so we can have time to deliver the rest of the presentation. So we'll come back to them later. Thank you everyone for asking so many questions. Really good to see everyone really involved. And I think in that case, you can continue presenting, Eve, on your second part.
Lovely. We had a little tea break. That's good. So you should be able to see that now. Yep. Perfect. So now we have explored the different types of research. What you can think about next is how you're going to fund that. Because none of it is cheap. I think even if you're thinking of doing structured interviews, you're going to want somewhere to do this. You're going to want, the right methods, and you might want some structure and a protocol built. So it costs a lot of time and a lot of money. I think it's important to look at what a funder actually is. So a funder is someone who quite literally pays for the research, but they actually have nothing to do with how that research is run day to day. They'll be very hands-off and kind of let it happen. They won't have any legal responsibility, and they won't have any they won't be able to get involved and change anything in terms of how the research is run. They will ask for feedback at certain points just to make sure that the investment they've put in is meeting their expectations and meeting the pre-agreed aims as part of the funding agreement. And confusingly, a funder is not the same as a sponsor. So you will see research sponsors, and sponsors kind of suggest a funding role. But a sponsor can be a funder. And a lot of the times you'll see a sponsor also being a funder would be universities and academia. So I think just, again, this resource is a report that will be shared in the materials we send after the webinar. But I think it's just important to show the context of the research funding landscape in the UK. So I've just popped this graph in to show the different, I would say these are the different kind of themes of research relative to different types of medical knowledge across the UK. And you can see that in blue, the charities are funding a lot of work into understanding disease mechanism and understanding how diseases work at a molecular level, And that really includes kind of the causes of disease and the patterns of disease and how that moves along throughout someone's life, with a lot less charitable funding going into prevention and disease management. And then just breaking it down even further, again, this is showing the different distributions of funding from different funders. And you can see, quite unsurprisingly at the top here, cancer has a big block of charitable funding. When you think in the UK, we have huge funders for cancer research, like Cancer Research UK. So it's quite an unsurprising trend to see there. You also see just underneath that, infection has a big block of government funding in orange and red there. Given the fact that this data was released in 2022, the fact that there's a lot of money going into research into infectious diseases makes a lot of sense to me, given what is going on in the landscape there. And then I think quite interestingly, down towards the bottom, there's quite a small spend across the board for congenital disorders. And I just think, I was thinking as I was looking at this graph, is this perhaps because we're focusing on specific parts of congenital disorders and we're funding them? So are we thinking about the neurological aspect? Are we thinking about the respiratory aspect rather than funding the disorders as a whole? So again, that's just quite an interesting thing to think about in terms of where you can go for funding and what you're kind of putting it under the umbrella of. In terms of, I've called this methods of funding. So this is the ways that funders might want to give you money. There's prospective funding, which realistically is quite uncommon. You might see this from philanthropic funders and other kind of like trusts and foundations, where you have a research idea that you present to them and they agree it's a good idea and they'll fund it that way. There's no deadlines, it's very flexible. Like I say, it's very uncommon. And the most common type of funding you'll see is this responsive type, where a funder they'll say that they want to fund a piece of work in a particular area and ask people to submit proposals. And then that proposal will be assessed by a panel of people, and then a certain subset of those proposals will go on to be funded. So that's a very traditional funding call, and it's all within set timeframes and set deadlines and fixed sums of money too. So moving on to just a bit about getting more into detail about the types of funders and what they might or might not fund. Commercial funders are basically businesses, they're companies that fundamentally want to invest in something that's going to give them a return on investment. So they are a for-profit funding stream. They do rely on the wider research infrastructure to undertake research. We have seen that some commercial funders can do research in-house. So for example, here in Cambridge, AstraZeneca have just built a huge new lab facility where they'll do pieces of preclinical research. But once it comes to the clinical trials, which is the research that commercial funders are most commonly funding, they need to rely on the rest of the research infrastructure. So they'll rely on the NHS hospitals, they'll rely on the universities that are associated with them too. Because of this very strategic for-profit approach, it's unlikely that a commercial funder is going to put out any calls for projects, and what they'll be funding is aligned with their pre-agreed strategy. But I think, encouragingly, despite the fact that they're working towards this business portfolio-based approach, that means that they're only going to fund things that increase profit. There can be a bit of a discord there between what they're funding to make profit and what patients actually need. But this statistic that actually Gabrielle shared recently in our Rare Chat on collaborations is that there's been a big increase in the last 8 years, a moderate increase in the last 8 years in the number of partnerships that are being formed with rare disease patient groups and pharmaceutical companies. And I hope that trend continues upward and we do see patient-centric treatment development. Just something to keep in mind is that when you do engage with pharma at any level, so any of these commercial funders, it's worth just keeping quite a thorough record of that, of when, what, how, and why, because this can interact later on down the line if you want to interact with regulators, particularly with the EMA in Europe. So just keep a record of what's going on and how you're talking to them to avoid any conflicts of interest later down the line, particularly if you're talking about the same drug or the same disease later on. So non-commercial funding is a lot more of a sprawling, kind of exciting way to get into funding, and it's all supported by the public. So it's all paid for by the public. And the two main ways that the public are funding research is through the government. So that's kind of, I would say, passively funded by the public, and then charities, so it's a bit more actively funded by the public. Both government and charities award grants to universities, and universities then have the freedom to go on and kind of distribute this funding within their areas of interest of research. They do have a bit of a remit coming from the charities and government, of course. You know, if you're donating money from your charity to one disease and they go decide to take it for another disease, that's really not okay. So there are some set parameters of which they can spend that funding on. Universities themselves do not have a large funding pot to share out for research. So when you see universities as funders, this is kind of the system that's happening here. They're not really funding it, they're just kind of safekeeping the money, if that makes sense. The nice thing about non-commercial funding is that it's a lot more free, and it can cover a lot more different types of research. So all of those qualitative methods, all of those slightly different methods, service evaluation, would come into non-commercial funding compared to the commercial funding where you're much more likely to see clinical trials happening. So moving into the specifics, government funders are people like the NHS, the NIHR, and the UKRI. And really, they're going to be focusing on supporting public health priorities and perceived public health needs in the country that is funding the research. Sometimes there's opportunity for them to explore these needs in like a bigger context, so like a global research need too, but often it will align more with kind of what's going on in that country at that particular time. Again, it can include all different types of research. So the NHS, you're going to see a lot of research into treatment evaluation of cost efficacy, service evaluation, but you're also going to see a lot of treatment development too. And again, like I said, all of these infrastructures and all of these organizations will be supporting the clinical trials that the commercial companies want to do. I would say the slight barrier to funding from the government is that the themes of the funding have really broad they overlap quite significantly, which means it's going to be a lot of competition for the same funding pot. And a lot of the time, some research is going to align a lot more naturally with what the funder wants than other pieces of research might do. So it's really important to think about looking at all the funding programs that exist and trying to find the one that fits in most of the question you're trying to ask and the question you're trying to answer. And again, tailoring your proposal to that can really help, drill down into where should I go for this funding and try and improve your chances of getting funded when so many people are sort of going for that same source. There's a big movement to including real world evidence and the patient voice and actually thinking about what the impact of this research will be if successful and if we get funded to do this. So it's really worth thinking about that and how you can really mold that application into something very unique. And I think that's where the role of patient groups does come into things here. Again, so this is from the NIHR website. This is the list of the current funding themes. And I just wanted to show you this to show that they are spanning kind of the full breadth of what goes on in medicine. So we've got a piece about policy, a piece about service provision. We've got that mechanism evaluation, which is basically what we were talking about, preclinical research, looking at cells and drugs and how they interact. So there really is something for everyone, and there really is, something specific and tailored that you can explore with your research question. When we think about charities as funders, I think charities are absolutely crucial in forming and funding research partnerships. I think charities are the glue that holds a lot of these research partnerships together, and they also help to really focus the outcomes and focus the aims of any research. The approach is going to be different based on the size of the charity, and I think that's just quite intuitive. Wellcome and LifeArc are going to have significantly different goals and aims to these smaller charities I've got listed here. like Deborah, who are doing very well at the moment with their research. But yeah, different sizes means different priorities and different approaches. I think charitable funding is great because no one knows the community better than the charities. So they're most likely to choose funding that is going to support and benefit people that they advocate for, the people that they represent in the biggest way. And I think that's so important to remember that actually, if you see research that is funded by a charity, this is likely going to have a significant impact on the community that they're working for. Of course, it does rely on fundraising, which ebbs and flows like everything. Fundraising is tricky, particularly at the moment. There's less, as I say, it's public funded. The public have less money to spend at the moment. So charities are exploring different ways of getting grants to support their funding. Yeah, it's very complex, and strategizing for this long term can be quite tricky. I think the great thing about charitable funding is the AMRC and the unique support system they offer. I don't think you see that in any of the other funders, and I think the AMRC can really offer advice on forming those connections and forming those systems and ensuring that as a charity, you're still getting answers to how your investment is being used. Just because that grant is given charitably does not mean you shouldn't be holding those people doing the research to account and saying, okay, well, I expected to see this. And then the AMRC really empower charities to have that role within research funding. And again, coming back to what I was saying, I think the smaller disease-specific charities are going to have really focused research priorities that will really speak to their community and what their community needs. And no one knows the community better than these charities, and it's just going to mean that this research has the maximum impact. Larger charities like Wellcome and LifeArc they're still very focused and they're still very driven in certain areas, and it will often be areas of unmet need, but they kind of focus on umbrella unmet needs. So right now, Wellcome and LifeArc are looking at antimicrobial resistance, which means that they're looking at new antibiotics and new ways of treating infection, which is an unmet need across the world right now. So coming back to academia, as I mentioned, they don't actually hold any substantial pot for funding research directly, but they're awarded grants from charities, government, and actually from commercial funders too. And then they distribute this onward, dependent on the university's research priorities and the priorities of the funder that's sent that funding downwards. But what universities offer that a lot of these funders, the other funders, don't offer is the infrastructure and expertise. So within universities, you're going to have trained specialists who specialize in questionnaire-based research. You're going to have clinical trial specialists. You'll have lab specialists in one specific tiny niche experiment that you need doing. And you're not going to find that anywhere else except for academia. And of course, they do have the labs. They have the clinical trials units, and the staff to support these pieces of research. Some universities will have small grants to supplement small pieces of research that often they actually supplement a bigger piece of research. They're often limited to internal applicants, so who you know and what they know is important. And I'll go through a couple of examples of these smaller projects they might fund in a moment. But yeah, so just knowing that they have these smaller grants that can be added on to bigger research projects is quite interesting. I think thinking about academia and thinking about academic funded research, university funded research, I think this is the place where patient groups can have quite a significant impact. Again, thinking about charitable funded research, collaboration, is paramount to that. And academics are going to be able to do that legwork. They're going to be able to put the scientific ideas down in a proposal. And what patient groups then need to do is to support that scientific piece of the funding proposal by saying, well, here's our voice and here's how it will help us and here's why we need it right now. And I think more than some of the other funders, perhaps the academia, universities and researchers within universities are slightly more open to this. I think a lot of us do have a friendly neighbourhood researcher. So that's a good place to start with research funding. Yeah, so just coming back to some of these smaller pots of funding within the universities, UCL offer this small grant. So if you did a piece of research and you were thinking about publishing it, that costs a lot of money actually, which means that your research stays with you and it's not shared openly, which is a shame. So UCL offer a small fund that helps you pay for the fees to get that research published. It means it's out there and it's accessible, which I think is really quite important actually. There's also a lot of research, excuse me, and a lot of funding into patient engagement and involvement at the moment. As I say, these are small grants and probably most useful supplementary to and the bigger research project. So perhaps you're doing a project on something and you want a little bit more patient insight into what's going on, apply for this small grant to run an event and run a focus group or run a set of interviews. And that might be the way to engage with this type of small grant offered by universities. And this slide just shows you that actually universities do have their own research priorities too. So Manchester University, this is their research priorities for the year this year, and that funding they're receiving from the government and charities is going to trickle down into these broad areas. They will be doing research in other areas as well, but what they're really going to be going for is funding that supports these. So a quick recap on the commercial and non-commercial side of funding. Commercial funders really, what they're looking at is providing a big cash injection to make sure that the drug product they've developed gets to market. So what they're looking at is projects that are going to give them a financial return on their investment. This is particularly tricky in rare disease, where there's a small population to market the drug to, which is why Rick and I will talk endlessly about drug repurposing and how that might work, but that's for another webinar. So yeah, so I think just remembering that if the commercial company does not see a return on the investment of a project, they're very unlikely to fund it. They have a very strict and very regimented approach to research, which means that there's less room for feeding from that real world evidence, and there's a little bit less room for engagement with patient groups and understanding the impact of the research they're doing too. And if it looks like that return on investment is unlikely, and that can be the science isn't going well, the government changes, the landscape changes, the new standard of care comes through, anything like that, they will just stop working on that project and pull the funding from it. So it's quite a ruthless, quite a structured, regimented approach to research. When we look at non-commercial funding, non-commercial funding is funded in what I would say are blocks. So each piece of funding will cover one specific part of a project. So if you were thinking of doing the same thing as a commercial company does, and you want to create a drug from scratch and take it to market, you would have one piece of funding that covers the preclinical work, looking at the cells in the lab, and then you would have one piece of funding for your trial, and you might even have one piece of funding for your early trials and one piece of funding for your late, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a lot of grants for one piece of research here. The nice thing about non-commercial funders is they are going to be a little bit more flexible with what they're expecting from you. They're not going to say, by the end of this, we absolutely want a drug that works. They might just want you to help them understand a bit more about the disease, about how a drug works and how it interacts with the body. So exploratory research is very much supported by non-commercial funders. They do require, like all funders, regular reporting on progress, making sure that their investment is being used wisely and is on track with the predetermined goals and aims of the project too. And as I said, the shorter funding window that non-commercial funders offer means that for a large research project, you're going to need more than one grant, and it's often worth thinking one step ahead. So if you've done that questionnaire and you're thinking, okay, I want to take this into the lab now, think about what's next and how you might go about preparing a grant for that step. So I hope throughout this presentation, you've kind of seen the importance of collaboration for research funding. And that really, in isolation, none of it works. No one can get research done in isolation, really. This statistic from the AMRC just shows that 85% of their members were awarding grants to British universities in 2022, just showing that connection between academia and charity is so, so important. And again, charities can be co-funders of research, and the NIHR actually asks that if you want to co-fund as a charity, you need to be connected to a researcher in that particular area. So again, just really encouraging that academic and charity interaction. This statistic just shows that what I was saying about the fact that charities understand their people better than anyone else, and that 91% of AMRC charities are directly involving the people that this research will benefit when making decisions about what research to fund. And then lastly, just to explore that the government share their facilities with academia, they share their facilities with industry, because a lot of the time actually the government and the universities have facilities that perhaps industry don't, and vice versa. So just creating that collaborative environment and sharing of not always funds, but sharing of facility and sharing of expertise is really important in getting research done. So I'm just going to briefly touch on some other funders. I'm not going to go into too much depth here. It's just to give you an overview of kind of what else is going on out there. Horizon Europe are funding research, as it says there, across Europe, across the EU. The work we're doing in Remedy for All as Beacon is funded by Horizon Europe. So it's a really great opportunity. There's a few consortia at the moment funded by Horizon Europe. So again, they're really enforcing that collaborative cross-national funding approach. Similar to that, we have the NIH, who represent the US and the funding opportunities in the US. Again, like the NHS, it can be quite focused to the priorities of America and what they're doing there. But quite often, those priorities will align with the rest of the Western world, and so perhaps we'll see some opportunities to co-fund. There's trusts and foundations who they have a bit more of a free-form approach to funding, and this is where you might see that prospective model of funding come in a bit more, where you go to a trust or a foundation with an idea, and they've just got a pot of money that they just kind of want to spend on some research. They see the value in what you've put together and are willing to fund that. The lottery I've very helpfully put as an other, because where does it come? It's funded by the public. It's not governmental. It's something special and quite unique to the UK, I think. Again, what you might see there is a bit more of that prospective approach, where you go with an idea and they fund good ideas rather than asking for specific. We want you to think about a project that fits into our box. And then we have the Royal Societies, who are sort of a membership-based organisation, and they will fund research in their specific areas of interest. So the Royal Society of Chemistry, for example, might be funding research on looking at drug discovery and drug interactions. So in summary, I hope that I have showed you that research funding can come from many different sources, and that actually none of them really work in isolation, apart from commercial funding, which is kind of its own entity. Each funder is going to have their own set of priorities, and that is going to affect what they choose to fund. So having that in mind when you are thinking about your research and how that's going to be funded is quite important. It can be really hard to apply for research, or even to apply for funding. And funding as a small charity, perhaps even harder. But collaborative funding is kind of the way that this works. So I think that's where patient groups have a really important role. Not an insignificant role, not an easy role, but I think setting up those collaborations and seeing who else is interested in what you are interested in is really important. You can fund multiple types of research at any one time, and you are probably going to have to be thinking about what is the next step if you're looking at a big research project. Patient groups can apply for funding for their own research, or they can come on and support bids, as we were talking about with the collaboration too. I think Toni is going to talk through a couple of different case studies of where that's worked in the case of Niemann-Pick. So yeah. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. That is.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Eve. That was super comprehensive as well. And again, I think everyone was super interested because we've got loads of questions, which is really nice. But I'm very conscious of time. So I think what we're going to do is to try and type answers to the questions.
Mhm.
And anyone that has any questions or outstanding questions that we can't answer today, please follow up with an email so that we can aim to answer or get to you. And I think now what we're going to do is to have Toni come and have her talk as well. So Toni, if you can turn your camera on and then share your slides whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you. And it's great to be here with everyone. Let me just get my slides up for you. Hopefully you can see those.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Toni.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and thank you so much to the Beacon team for inviting me to join you. And I'm really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to share our experiences of funding research. I'm speaking to you as CEO of Niemann-Pick UK, but I have several other hats in this sector, and one of which is chair of the LSD Collaborative, and I will tell you more about that organisation later in the talk. But I'm also part of two of our sister organisations, and they play an important role in our research funding strategies, so I will be mentioning them too as we work through these slides. Niemann-Pick UK is a national charity. We're in our 33rd year, and since our early beginnings, research has been incredibly important to us. It's fundamental. It's something that we feel we have to do in order to make progress. And I think somebody mentioned in the chat about being creative, and you have to think as a patient organisation, you have the drive and ambition to make a difference for your community. So anything you can do to facilitate research is incredibly important. Niemann-Pick diseases are a group of rare genetic conditions. We share many challenges with our ultra-rare and rare friends across the sector, not least small populations, complex symptoms. And of course, all of these things make it incredibly challenging for the research and therapy development space. And what do we do? Well, we do all of the things that you would expect a patient organisation to do. We provide expert care, support and advocacy services. We're here for our community with networks and opportunities. But of course, for today, I'm focusing on what we do to encourage and facilitate research. We have extensive networks and contacts within the field, which we've developed over many, many years, and our activities aim to bring together those networks and contacts and to help them form new collaborations that we might see new ideas come from, and therefore other opportunities for us to fund research. Some of the things that we do to facilitate that, not only our activities, is to provide grant opportunities for early career researchers, such as the William French Memorial Award and the Peter Carlton Jones Memorial Award, which we do on an annual basis. And we provide small seed grants and bridge funding. But of course, today we're talking about how we collaborate and how we access research for bigger projects. And as a small patient organisation, it's very difficult for us to fund research on our own. As we've just heard from Eve, it's not really advisable. We need to work with experts and people who know what they're doing so that our research is robust and that it follows scientific process, and that at the end we have something that we can share and use. So we do a lot of joint projects and partnership funding, and we partner with academics and clinical collaborations, but also with other patient organisations as well. We have an expert research committee that involves many different disciplines from across the sector, and they help to guide what we do and consider what the benefits are of each project that we get involved in for our community. And we also work to gather data and evidence that will support and encourage further research, but also that it will help in approvals and reimbursement should we be successful. We talk about meaningful research collaborations in our condition because we want everything that we do to resonate across the sector, but also particularly for the patients who are affected by Niemann-Pick diseases. And we've already heard that research funding is hard won, and therefore it's important that we can maximize every opportunity that we have and use every resource to its maximum. So our research focuses on understanding our diseases better, to developing potential therapies, improving patient care, and to making sure that we are always aware of the unmet needs that exist within our community, and that we're considering the impact of any treatments that exist and how that might have changed the natural history of the disease. And the examples on the bottom of this slide, you know, we've been involved in some of the things that Eve has already talked about, such as natural history studies, supporting and partnering, and I'm going to talk about how we get involved with academia in a moment. The collaborative therapeutic development, and that might be through academia, but also in regard to industry work too, and the data collection and evidence generation, which we do primarily through our registry. But how do we fund research? So we fund our activities through community fundraising and campaigns, of course. I think that's one of the things we all do, but you can never raise enough money necessarily to fund a whole project in that way, or we can't. Bigger organizations might have more success than us in that way. So we tend to look at academic or clinical collaborations and joint grant applications, or to provide smaller seed funding that enables an academic or institution to get a grant. We also partner with multinational consortia such as Horizon Europe, CPATH in the US, to be able to undertake research projects that are of interest not just to us, but perhaps to the wider lysosomal storage disorder community. And then we collaborate with other patient organizations in the Niemann-Pick space, but also in the wider space, to undertake projects that are of mutual benefit to all of us. And finally, of course, industry. And working with industry comes with its own set of rules and guidance that you have to be aware of, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So why collaborate with academic institutions? Well, of course, they bring research credibility, but they're also experts in how to undertake this type of research, and they have access to infrastructure. Some of them might have already have expertise in your disease area, but even if they don't, then they're going to learn, and therefore you're broadening your networks and encouraging new understanding and collaboration. So it's always useful to have those conversations and links. And of course, many grants and funding opportunities, which we heard from Eve, prefer or prioritize collaboration, and that includes academic and patient group partnerships. And so it's really good idea to have those conversations and to show that the patient organization is supporting a piece of work, and that it's based on unmet needs within the community, and that it will have an impact afterwards. And collaborating in this way really does enhance a project, and it makes sure that you're capturing the patient views and perspective within that design, the study design, and again, that it's going to make an impact when it's finished. And that when I talk about it being finished, we're thinking about the publications that come from that. What evidence is generated? Can it be used in health technology appraisals? What are you doing to raise awareness using that research? Can you increase understanding? Can you share it with colleagues across the sector? Okay, so some of the ways in which we have collaborated with academia include making joint applications, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. And this really helps us to not only to form new partnerships, but to make sure that we are seen to be using any research funding that comes in from our communities as well, to perhaps to provide the seed funding that gets these applications off the ground. And then we also act as an advisor in many different applications or in any different projects, to make sure that we're accurately capturing the patient voice, and that we can not only increase participation in a resulting study or a trial, but that the patient voice is represented right from the beginning and we get it right. Data sharing as well. So we've provided information from our registry, but also from surveys that we undertake as a community, which then spearheads a research project and can lead to bigger studies in academia or even to clinical trials. So what are the challenges that you need to consider? At the very beginning, it's really important to consider what the goals are that you have as a patient organisation and whether they align with the academic institution, whether your goals are reflected in that research plan, and that at the end of the research, will you be able to say to your community, yes, this is what we had in mind and this is what we wanted to see come out of this piece of research. When you are navigating complex grant processes, you need to think about who is going to do the work, who is going to make that application. Is it going to be your academic partner? Will you be able to use their expertise in that, or will you need to hire someone, or do you have that expertise yourself? You really need to think about these things as a small patient organisation. For us, we have to think about our capacity. It can take quite a long time to complete these applications and to follow up with grant reports, etc. Data ownership in IP is very, very important. So clear data sharing agreements are very important before you start, so that you can be sure that you can share the outcome of your research to the benefit of your community, and that you can use it in the ways that you think will be useful for that community. An example of a project here is a project that we undertook with the University of Oxford with Professor Francis Platt. And this was looking at an existing drug, so it's a drug repurposing project that was used to treat multiple sclerosis. And we thought that it might be able to repurposed as a new treatment for NPC. So we worked with Professor Platt to create an application, and we needed to provide some seed funding to start that. And we worked with 4 different organisations from around the world to do that. And each contributed a very, very small amount, perhaps I think it was between £5,000 and £10,000 each, to kickstart this grant, which enabled us to make the grant request to Action Medical Research and to get the funding of over £150,000 to complete the project. And so what was the outcome of that project? Well, the results have been incredibly encouraging. And we tested the drug in combination with a drug that already exists, the one treatment that we have for Niemann-Pick type C, and we saw that it increased its efficacy. And so it is encouraging results, but of course there is more research that is needed now. So we're working towards a grant that will enable that confirmatory research before moving, hopefully, towards a potential clinical trial. And I think this is a great example of the collaboration that it took to get this type of research off the ground, but also the encouraging results that came from it. But of course, that's not always the case. You never know where a research project is going to go. And you also have to be prepared for that from the outset, that the research might not have the outcome that you wanted to see. But of course, I never think anything is a failure. It's always a learning, and then you know where to go next. Another example is a project that we undertook with a multinational group, which was spearheaded by Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, under the guiding hand of Professor Tariq Hiwat. And this came about from conversations at Niemann-Pick conferences, our international conferences to be precise, in 2011, and we started to talk about the need for a patient registry. And we've had registries mentioned in the chat today, and the difficulties of accessing information in pharma registries or other registries where you perhaps need to pay a fee, or it's just a completely closed book and you can't access that information and it's not available to researchers. And we wanted to see progress in our disease, and we felt that the best way forward was to create our own registry that we could then enable access to and make sure that that information, the data that was coming from our own community, was, you know, having a return on investment for that community. So we worked together to secure Horizon 2020 funding, and thankfully we were successful, and we had over 1.2 million euros to use in that project over 3 years. But of course, then, there's the end of the project in 2016, and you think, right, how are we going to take that forward? So what was the outcome? But the outcome still exists today. I'm really pleased to say that the International Niemann-Pick Disease Registry is going from strength to strength. And we say that progress is made possible by you, and that's by the people, of course, that are participating in this registry, as their information is so incredibly valuable, and that it is able to support research, it's able to support therapy development, it's there to support the approvals process. So we are incredibly grateful to still have this project running and to be running in a sustainable way as its own entity. And that's come from that initial grant that we had from Horizon 2020. A third example is an example of working with industry. We wanted, in this example, to understand the use of existing NPC clinical severity scoring scales. And this came up as a question at one of our conferences. And it was decided that a consensus was required. So we decided to take on that piece of work and to look for funding to support it. We approached different pharmaceutical companies for grants, so multiple industry sources, because obviously we want to make sure that we maintain our independence and our integrity in all of our research. And they didn't have any influence or input into that process, but they gave us grants to fund it. And we were able to then take that forward and to do the Delphi study, which resulted in a publication in the Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases, and that has been fantastically useful for our clinical community, but also as we've moved towards the approvals with the regulators in the US and here in Europe and in England now, that they can see that this scale is something that is supported by the clinical community. So the benefits of research collaboration, in my mind, are many. Not only do they help to educate and inform everyone who's involved, but they really do push the pace of research and help to increase the understanding of a disease. And I think those connections, I always come back to the fact that relationships and connections within research or in patient advocacy are incredibly important. And it is one of the best ways to push progress. The insights that you get from the patient community through registries, through surveys, through whatever piece of research you're doing, they enable the researchers to understand what's needed, and therefore they enable the development of therapies. And you've got to start by understanding a community's needs and understanding how they change over time. So it's multiple pieces of work that are required to keep on top of that, especially in a changing, in a progressive condition like ours. They also can influence changes in standards of care, regulation. When you think about those collaborations, the work that you do together can have a wide-reaching impact. So it's great to be able to consider how you would use that piece of work afterwards, perhaps to communicate with clinical teams, the Department of Health, governments. And of course, most important for me is to make sure that patient representation and that patient voice is there and involved at all stages. An example of this, or a great example, is the UK LSD Collaborative. And I said earlier, I'm chair of this organisation currently. We formed in 2005 and we've been working together ever since. We're now a registered charity, and that being a registered charity is enabling us to take on joint research projects ourselves and to make applications in collaboration with our clinical and academic partners. And we are currently looking at projects in patient-reported outcome measures and looking at carer burden, and also at biomarkers. So we've got a bright future there, and of course that benefits so many people. Of course, the research funding doesn't come without challenges. I wish that was the case, especially presently. in the environment that we've seen post-Brexit and post-COVID, where there are reducing opportunities to get involved in research funding, but also a highly competitive environment as well. And things are changing now. There are new mechanisms coming in from the EU. However, they're not quite clear enough right now as to how we get involved in them, and we have experienced some very difficult moments where we've been unable to take part in collaborative funding, or we've been kicked out really because of the strange European situation, which is not ideal. So that uncertainty, it ultimately impacts investment in research in our area, and of course progress for our patients and families. So it isn't something that is fun to deal with, but there are different ways to meet those challenges and to think about it. And of course, creativity is one area of doing that, being able to work through our international arm, the International Niemann-Pick Disease Alliance that I mentioned earlier. So we've been able to have that organisation involved, and therefore as a member organisation for NP UK to be involved. And we're also thinking of having a European base as well, not for NP UK, but again for our international organisation, so that we can make sure that we can benefit from funding opportunities in the future. So finally, just to say that, together, we make a bigger difference. A rare disease is a rare disease on its own. It's not going to make as big a difference as working together. So I like this quote. It sums it all up for me, that as an ocean, we can take over the world, hopefully, in research. Thank you.
Thank you, Toni. That was really nice. It was really good to learn about all the different experiences you've had, your input as well, your insights, and the challenges and how you've navigated them. I think it's really inspiring, and I think I can speak in name of everyone. I think everyone thinks the same. So again, thank you for coming today. So I think now we've got some time for questions. We again have a lot. Some questions have been answered on the Q&A box. So if you guys go on that, you can see if your question has been answered or no. And now I think we can have both Eve as well, if you'd like to turn your camera on, and we can just ask some questions to both Toni and Eve. So I think one of the first things that people asked while you were speaking, Toni, was, could you please elaborate on the process of partnerships with multinational consortia such as Horizon Europe?
Yes, certainly. So we were looking for a very large amount of funding for our registry, and the Horizon Europe Fund was ideal for that, but it does require partnership, and there would not have been any way that as a small patient organisation we could have done that on our own. So we really benefited from the partnership working with Dr. Hiwatt and the team at Queen Elizabeth, but also with the 11 other partners who were academic and patient organisation institutions from across the world. And it took that collaborative effort that we were able to bring together, because we already had established contacts in these places, to be successful in that. And it was a hard process. I have to say, it's not an easy process to go through, and it is very bureaucratic. And we could not, as I said, we could not have done it without the support of the QE.
Thank you, Toni. Someone else asked, how do you find the academic team to partner with?
So that's a very good question. And yes, so we're very lucky as a patient organisation that's 30 odd years old. We have many, many contacts. But originally we reached out to different academic institutions via a letter, believe it or not. It was that long ago, and we made contacts that way, and just went out and met people. And I think that's incredibly important too. Use the opportunities that Beacon supplies and many others supply to go to these events where you can meet people who are doing this type of research. And even if it's not particularly in your area of research, they probably know people who are doing research in your area or who might be interested, and that's the way to do it. So get yourself out there, write to people, take every opportunity to broaden your network.
Yeah, thank you again, Toni. We also have someone asking, I think you've briefly mentioned this as well, Toni, but they're asking, can you talk about how you organize the international collaboration from legal and organizational perspective for the registry?
Yes, well, for our registry, when we first started, obviously that was covered through our Horizon 2020 grant. When the registry project ended, the grant funding project ended in 2016, the whole project and the data and the assets that were included with that project were handed over to our International Niemann-Pick Disease Alliance, our international organisation. And then we worked with a legal team to create a framework as to how that would be managed and going forward. And then we created a company. So it's a not-for-profit company, the registry now, as its single entity. And it has its own set of governance rules and regulations now that it follows in regard to data sharing and how it works with all of the clinical centres who enter data, but also the patients who enter data for themselves. So that is a subject of a whole other webinar. But if anybody is interested in learning about those governance procedures and processes, we would be very happy to share.
Perfect. Thank you, Toni. And I think we have time for one more question. So someone also asked, who ensures the quality standard of data in international registries?
I mean, Toni, I think you probably have more experience of sort of overseeing registries, because I think to my mind the international quality data would be the individual who houses the registry. I think there's going to be a set sort of protocol to how that's managed, isn't there? But I will let you speak with more experience.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes, we have very strict governance data policies and procedures for the registry, and we work with EMA and with the FDA and with CPATH and others to make sure that the data is held and used appropriately and can be shared appropriately so that it is suitable for regulatory approvals, etc. And again, you know, we can go into depth on that for anyone who is interested. I would connect those with our registry team who are absolute experts in that area.
Perfect. Thank you both. Again, I'm sorry, everyone, if we couldn't answer all of your questions. I was quite conscious of time, but if you really want us to try and answer one of them, if we know the answer, please reach out to us later on an email and we'll aim to get back to you. But otherwise, I think I'm going to start presenting again. So thank you, Toni and Eve, once again, and that way we can wrap up. Hopefully you can see my slides again. Now, I'd just like to tell you what's coming up with Beacon. So obviously part 2 of this webinar is going to be happening on the 23rd of January at 11. So the same time as today. You can find all of our details on our website. You just need to scroll down because part 2 is at the very bottom of the page. And again, we have another Eventbrite that you need to register to in order to get your Zoom ticket, if that makes sense. And in this one, we'll be exploring how patient groups can collaborate with researchers to make stronger and more competitive applications. So hopefully this one is going to be slightly more practical. Then we also have a new guide on the Resources Hub, which is our online, free and accessible educational platform where we have very different resources like courses. And this one was written by our wonderful volunteer, Georgia Kennedy, on exploring the ethics of genetics testing. And I think Hannah will be sending you a link as well if you want to learn more or enroll on the course. And there's the Drug Repurposing Conference happening next year on the 7th and the 8th of May in Amsterdam. And there's a bursary form that you can fill out as a patient or as a patient group, where we can give up to 320 euros to cover expenses like traveling and accommodation and the ticket. So please have a look into this if you're involved in drug repurposing or would like to attend the conference. I think Hannah will also be sending the form for you to register interest and apply. And if not, you can also find it online. And lastly, I just want to ask you, as usual, what you thought of this webinar. I hope it was useful. I hope you liked learning about the different types of funding that exist and also about Toni's experience in many different sectors. So please complete the survey once we close the webinar. You'll be redirected to it. And if not, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on an email or through many different ways. So thank you again for coming, everyone. And I hope to see you in part 2. But please remember to register separately on a different Eventbrite on our website. Thank you.